Hello everybody, I'm back with another video for you today, and while there isn't too much time left on this patch, we have the expansion coming out in just over a week now. I still wanted to bring you a bit of a meta snapshot for any of you that are lost at sea and just a bit confused as to what to play on the pro ladder, on regular ladder, whatever. So here's going to be another Scuffed meta snapshot for you guys. Let's jump into it. So I've put Harmony as tier 1 Scoia'tael. I think most people agree that Harmony is one of the strongest decks, if not the strongest, and it's very easy to play compared to some other decks, as a very defined game plan of wanting to try to win round 1 and then push round 2 with the waters most of the time, or just going into round 3 with double waters and, you know, sealing the deal. So at this point you've probably seen a lot of this deck because it's one of the most popular and most kind of easy to pilot while being pretty strong decks. So that's why it's got a place at tier 1. I think no other deck is really quite as easy to play, as prolific and as, you know, valuable as this deck. So tier 1 deck, I think that comes as no surprise really. Harmony has been very good for a very long time at this point. Okay, next up, we've got a bit of Syndicate. I think Syndicate sits in tier 2 quite nicely, and there's a few ways you can play it, but usually it's going to be with Passiflora because you really need that scenario to get your points with the faction. If you don't run it, you're going to be kind of lacking a little bit. If you get bomb heaved, it's a bit of a struggle sometimes, and Passiflora being bled can be a real issue for you. Maybe let me just refresh quickly because the card arts are bugged. But yeah. This deck is definitely strong. A lot of people play Jackpot. It allows you to boost up engines or cards that you want to keep alive. You know, you're thinking things like possibly Uold or your Scarabs from Azar, or, you know, potentially a Seductress or whatever it might be. Some people are also running Imke because she can be really good with, you know, boosting with Jackpot. But, you know, you've also got maybe Morale, Tin Boy as options. So different things you can try depending on what you're, you know, wanting to be good against. But this deck is definitely a strong one for Syndicate. A lot of kind of ways to abuse the coin flip and remove the opponent's stuff, deal with long rounds very well, and potential for decent short rounds as well with carryover and card advantage. So pretty solid deck. And the other way you can do Syndicate is with Wildcard, which is again a reasonably common thing to see. It's probably a little bit weaker than Jackpot overall, a little bit less flexible, prone to bricking, and harder to play overall. So I would probably recommend just going with Jackpot if you are looking for kind of the best Syndicate deck to play. As I say, the main factor here with Wildcard is it's quite a bit harder to play than Jackpot, so you're going to end up losing a few games because you mismanage your Graydon, or you don't quite get the Slanders to work properly, or whatever it might be. So this deck's a little bit trickier. Probably has a higher ceiling. There are certain matchups where Wildcard is better than Jackpot, but, you know, thinking monsters in particular. But otherwise, Jackpot's just more of a safe and reliable option for Syndicate, and you have more provisions to work with and less, you know, don't have to worry so much about making mistakes. Alright, next up we have the other Scoia'tael deck, Deadeye Ambush. A lot of people enjoyed this one over Harmony, myself included. It's very vulnerable to Row Punish, which a lot of people tend to run these days. Lacerates, Triss Lacerate, even Surrender can be quite annoying because you're wanting to stack rows with your elves for Yaevinn and Oak. But if you don't run into that stuff, this deck is very formidable, has a huge amount of tempo and just big burst potential, which you can use to bully the opponent in round 2 or round 1 if you're going second. And that can often just give you pretty easy wins. Otherwise, you're just a deck that has a lot of value, a lot of poisons to shut down the opponent's, you know, big units, and just a lot of good value cards overall. So really strong deck. Venossil value can get a little bit insane as well if you're running an LES version, which I think most people prefer to do. And then we've got Greatswords actually in tier 2. I think the other Skellige decks are not as good as Greatswords. Greatswords seems to be the one deck that is able to win quite a lot of the time against quite a lot of things. Probably the only really horrible matchup is against Nilfgaard, because they have a lot of armor and they don't care about you doing things with the Greatswords too much. But, you know, apart from that, I think every matchup is winnable for this deck. Even Scoia'tael with Malenia, which can definitely be tricky, but if they even save Malenia for round 3, it's sometimes not enough if the round 3 is long enough. So Keep in mind that Defender is really key to, you know, potentially stop your guys from being moved in that sort of a matchup. But yeah, definitely a very strong deck. Greatswords is going to pick up wins against everything that's very unoptimized, or any deck that is sort of not having direct answers to it, like Nilfgaard or like a Malena. And even then, you can still get some wins occasionally with the Greatswords. So Greatswords is a very good deck, and I think it's a bit more reliable, a bit stronger than the other Skellige options. And then in Nilfgaard for tier 2, I debated putting these decks in tier 1, but I haven't seen too much of them recently, and yeah, I think Bull Nilfgaard definitely has a very big weakness, being the Bomb Heaver. Since you're not even trying to resurrect the Bull and play it twice with a Sire, if you get Bomb Heavered while playing this deck, it's really, really not good fun. And the deck definitely lacks points quite a bit, I think, once you do run into that problem, especially when you're running cards like Roderick, which are just kind of not all that hot in later rounds, and Albric as well. You know, these guys can brick pretty easily. Your Invocation is also quite high rolly in how it gets its value, so you know, this is not a bad deck, and it's very, very powerful when they don't have a Bomb Heaver, which is why people like it, because typically if you're against Harmony, the tier 1 deck, you can do a pretty good job against them, because they often don't run Bomb Heaver, because they're harmonizing. But yeah, I would say this deck is very good if you don't get Bomb Heavered. If not, it's quite a bit weaker, and I have another option for you if you're not a fan of the Bomb Heaver scenario interaction. And that is going to be this version, still with some poisons, but with some row punish as well. You've got morale and you know, some fangs and things. Cupbearer. Occasionally you can also trick the opponent into thinking you have a Bull, and they'll have a Bomb Heaver for round 3, but that's kind of a rare occurrence. This deck just has a lot of good cards, kind of all of the good Nilfgaard cards, which get reliable value, and just, yeah, even a Helga in there with bribery to kind of guarantee you a bit of value against certain factions. Just a solid deck, and this one won't do you wrong even if you're up against artifact removal or movement, as something like Elder Bears would. I haven't put Elder Bears, you know, Stefan and Damien in this snapshot because I haven't seen them very much, and I think they're just a bit weaker than the alternatives here in tier 2. But you know, it's an option with Stefan, maybe with Damien as well. I've seen it occasionally. I've played it myself as well, but I don't think it's really worthy of being on the snapshot because it's not very popular at the moment. And also not too strong. Next we have Northern Realms Drought. I've put it at tier 2. Some people might think it's even stronger than that, but I think it has its weakness still, which is being pushed in round 2. It definitely has some good matchups though against some of the popular decks, you know, particularly things like Harmony. It can do a fair, you know, have a fair shot against them, as well as against other things, and just Drought is a real pain for certain decks to deal with. If they don't want to push round 2, it can be a problem, but yeah, it's definitely not the best overall deck in long rounds because you've got the Greatswords kind of rivaling them, and yeah, it's a good deck overall. I would not say it's super OP, and it's also not played that much, at least I haven't seen a huge amount of Drought on ladder, but it's definitely a worthy deck for tier 2 and probably should be your pick if you're going Northern Realms this season, and I know a lot of people are doing that as their 4th faction, or even 3rd faction over Syndicate. Alright, next up we have tier 3 deck, so another Northern Realms deck. I'm not a huge fan of this one. I think other people will say it's maybe tier 2, because it does have a huge amount of power with all of the good value, just raw value cards. This is a mid-range NR deck. Some people even play Shoop. In fact, Shoop is probably more common than not Shoop, but I haven't tinkered around with this list for a while. But yeah, this is just a good value deck. If you draw your golds, you're usually in pretty good shape against most things. That's the problem though, drawing your golds. And for me, this deck is a bit too inconsistent to make it into tier 2. I think it struggles a bit with the consistency factor. You only have a small amount of golds, and if you don't draw all of these, your games are typically going to be a bit harder to win. So that's why I haven't put this, you know, higher tier. I think it's a bit inconsistent, along with things like Lippe, which I've also put in tier 3. So talking about Lippe, maybe let's move on and talk about that. We have it here. Very decent deck if you get the right coin flip, if you have the right hand and you're able to abuse the opponent, or if you're playing against an opponent that doesn't quite know how to beat you, then you're going to be having a great time with this deck. And it's a pretty straightforward one to pilot. You just want to smork, go face, just play all your cards, smash them, get that Ceres for round 3 and replay it, and then you're good to go. There are some versions of Lippe right now running Bone Talisman and Triss, which is interesting. I don't think that's particularly strong because it kind of goes against what the Lippe deck wants to do, which is to push round 2 and really get a short round 3 for that Ceres, but I've seen people playing it, so it's worth noting. But yeah, as I said, Lippe is a little bit inconsistent, same as that NR deck. I don't particularly like them for that reason, and I think there's better options in terms of consistency. Speaking of, you could play this mid-range Skellige deck, which a lot of people have been playing recently, and it's not bad. I've even seen versions of this with double Greatsword being played, and certain other things, but this is not a bad deck. I put it in tier 3, I think it's just a bit lacking sometimes, and I think once the opponent knows what they're up against, it's a bit easier to handle, and if they are a bit cautious about you being Greatswords or you being potentially a Gedyneith deck, which is another deck that has been played quite a lot recently, but I haven't put it in the Snapshot because now it's being replaced by this deck for the most part. This tends to just be better than Gedyneith, because Gedyneith's a bit too high rolly. Again, you have to set up all of your stuff in the graveyard to make that scenario round 3 work, and it can just be a bit difficult to get there. Again, I think this deck has a similar problem. You've got a lot of cards that just need to be drawn in round 1, like your Crow Mother, like your Wild Boar, and it can just be a bit difficult to actually win the game if you don't win round 1. That can be really a struggle, and sometimes you're going to have problems with that if you don't get a really decent hand, or you're up against someone that can deal with your stuff. This deck should maybe even be running double Longship now that I think about it, but yeah, it's a decent deck. Personally, I'm not a huge fan, and I don't think it's super strong. I think it's fitting into that tier 3 zone pretty nicely. Next up, we have all the monster decks, I think, are in tier 3. We've got a lot of different ways to play monsters, with vampires being the most common way. Here we have organics. I have to refresh because they still haven't fixed this damn card bug. But yeah, this is a pretty good shout. Just very good against other monster decks, actually. Very good against people playing Lava because you have Glusty Warp to eat those. But otherwise, it's just a good value deck. It can deal with certain things quite nicely with the Lacerate and with the Triss, possibly. Things like Deadeyes can maybe get crushed by this. And you've got good matchup against Syndicate, typically, as long as you're not facing into Wildcard. So this is definitely an option for monsters. Depends on what meta you're seeing. It's probably a bit weaker against Nilfgaard than your typical monster deck. And maybe even against Harmony, but against other things, this is a pretty decent shout, pretty decent option. And yeah, Vampires is typically a little bit stronger, I would say, and it's more popular as well. So, but I think it's on a pretty similar power level to the Arrakis Swarm deck. And again, you're just getting that big Orianna with Blood Scent value, and it really is good at sort of pushing and getting a lot from the opponent round 2 if you're able to do that, or just going into a reasonably long round 3, maybe 6 or 7 cards, getting some hefty Orianna value. And if the opponent can't answer that, they're typically going to lose. So Cave Trolls are nice to protect your Orianna sometimes and abuse the opponent if they did already use their Purify. And otherwise you have a lot of tools to deal with a lot of things and just generally have a lot of points with Lava and Orianna and Vampires and good stuff like that. And we also have Fruits of Isgith here. I wanted to include this deck. While it's not very popular, I think this deck is definitely pulling punches as well as the other monster decks. It's definitely as strong, if not stronger than those guys. So if you're looking for something a bit different to play for monsters, then I would recommend this Gurnakora list. Just has an abundance of points, with that leader allowing you to secure rounds very, very cheaply, especially in round 1, and go on to sort of crush round 2 with all those big players. Might not look like much, but the Caranthea Living Armor does work wonders in this deck, and gets you a real hefty amount of finishers which you can use to beat down the opponent. So this deck's very good. Check out my gameplay video if you haven't, and if you're not convinced on this one. Okay, and now we've got tier 4 decks. I've put Congregate, Crime Syndicate here. Some people might think it's a bit stronger than this, but I personally don't. It's a deck that's very easily pushed, I think, and has really not very much finisher potential. You might think Gord is quite a decent finisher, but I don't find that to be the case. Most of the time you're just going to get outvalued by the opponent's leader. Your leader is tied to your Horson Senior, so it's very bleedable in that sense, and then you have quite a weak leader after that point, and yeah, the deck just seems to fall apart in shorter round 3s where you don't have crime synergies going on. But of course it can cheese out opponents very easily who don't quite realise what they're dealing with, don't know that they have to kill the clown from Horson Senior, for example, or that they need to push very, very hard and not give up rounds. And it can be difficult for decks to deal with, if they don't have a sufficient amount of removal or push potential. So this deck can win games, and I put it in tier 4 because I think it's just a bit unreliable and not great. Also worth noting, some people are playing the Kurt card, or whatever he's called. I don't even know how much provisions he is. This guy, Kurt, yeah. That's quite a common inclusion these days. I'm not sure what you would take out exactly, but people are playing that because it's another Intimidate unit. That probably makes the deck a little bit stronger running this guy, but I don't think it's enough to boost this deck into tier 3. But, you know, that's a debate you can have with yourself and maybe even in the comments if you want. But I'm not a huge fan of this deck. Could arguably be a tier 3 deck, but I'm putting it in tier 4. Again, we've got Kiki Moore, just again, tier 4. I don't know, this is not very popular at the moment, but it's always kind of hanging out. It's an option if you want a Death Shadow deck that's always going to be decent but very abusable, and good players are going to be able to shut you down most of the time. But against players that have not got it going on, similar kind of thing with Crime Syndicate. It has the potential to win. It's really just a matter of, can your opponent find the lose condition for them? Can they not push you in round 2? And if they're not doing that, then you're going to be in good shape and definitely winning a lot of games. So I think this is very similar to the Crimes in how it functions in terms of cheesing out wins in a way, and really not having that much there once the opponent knows what they're doing. But it's a decent deck still if you want something else to climb with monsters and want a bit of solitaire monsters action. And finally we have double Bull in the final category here. This is probably a bit of an outdated list at this point. Should probably not be running Lambert but Triss instead of the Lambert. But you know, this is definitely an option. I'll probably just tinker around with this deck after the video ends and get you a more updated version of Double Bull. Double Bull's still not very good in my opinion. I think it was very weak to Bomb Heaver. Once you get Bomb Heavered, you're really shut down, and even more so than something like Imperial Formation Bull, because you're tied into playing Thirsty Dames and Rock Tossers and cards like that, which are very bad if your Bull gets answered, typically. But this is another consideration to be in tier 3 rather than tier 4. I put it here because I think it's just unreliable. Really requires you to draw Bull round 1, and you're very likely to get Bomb Heavered and shut down a fair number of your games. So yeah, that's my Scuffed meta snapshot, guys. Let me know what you think, if I've got it right, wrong, if I've missed anything very important. I think this is a pretty good one. I was pretty proud of my last snapshot because I did call that Harmony and Ambush were tier 1 worthy, both having the highest win rates on ladder, because the win rates did get published. So I feel like I know what I'm doing on some level with these snapshots, even though they're a little bit scuffed, but let me know what you think anyway. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Do remember to subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.